Once upon a time, the story I'm fixing to tell you is true. The day I almost died in my private plane. Oh, I'll never forget it. You see, just a few moments ago, I was sitting here admiring the majesty and the glory of the Creator because His creation is amazing. And He is revealed in His creation. Even His eternal power and Godhead is revealed. Pretty amazing. But I was thinking as I watched just a few moments ago, and maybe while I'm videoing, we'll get the opportunity to see another one. A bird that came and was flying off the updraft wind of this mountain and was just soaring aloft in midair without flapping its wings. I know you've seen that happen before. And it reminded me of the day I almost died. Let me explain. The air and the wind is best described in the water. Do you see the water choppy? A few things will do that. The wind will do that to the water, but also underneath the surface or the current, there is rocks, uneven surfaces. And as the water runs down, the water underneath the current, the undercurrent, is having turbulence and restrictions that's causing it to bowl up and cause what we see on top of the water. Oh, and what a message there is there. Many times what we see on the surface isn't what it is at first glance because we can't see what's going on underneath. And boy, all that we see going on in the world today, what we see is the surface level boil overs. But it really is what's going on underneath the surface in the spirit realm that's causing the choppy waves that we're seeing in our society today. But back to my story about the day I almost died. You see, water describes the wind, and I want to show you this rock out here. In the middle of this river is this amazing rock sitting there. And if I could show you that the backside of the rock is, the water is higher, the level of the water is higher than on the downstream side. Do you see that? The water's almost breaking over the top of the upstream side, but it's down almost a foot on the downstream side. What's happening there is similar to what happens in an airplane wing. What's going on here is the water hits that rock creates a restriction. The water bowls up, creates a back pressure to the point it finally breaks. See the white water? It bowls up, then it breaks over and runs around the rock faster than the rest of the water in the river is running, because on the backside of the rock there was no water running because the rock was in the way, and that creates a hole in the water or a vacuum. And so the water comes in to that hole and tries to fill it in quickly, and it creates like a vacuum. You could throw a stick in that and it'll just sit there and suck under and flip up and go under and come back and go under, because there's a vacuum there, a hole trying to always be filled with water. And that's the way an airplane wing works. If you remember, the top of the wing is curved, the bottom is flat, the front is kind of a bow. And so when you get wind going over the wing fast, it bowls up, creates a back pressure, runs over the top with the restriction all the way to the top of the wing, and then runs down the back portion of the bow of the wing fast, and that underneath the wing runs really fast and creates that vacuum like on the backside of that rock, and we call that in aeronautics lift. Now what happens is, in an airplane, I had just bought my first Cherokee 6 300 horse 7-seater and was flying it back. At the time I was working on my pilot's license. I hired a professional pilot to fly me. Interesting story. The reason I bought an airplane is I used to pastor in several cities, overseeing several churches: Fresno, Bakersfield, Sonora, Tehachapi, Mojave. And the drive from Sonora to Bakersfield was 4 hours one way, 8 hours round trip. And so an airplane made it an hour and a half one way, 3 hour round trip. So it made all the sense in the world. And you say, why Sonora? Well, I grew up in the mountains of Sonora. There was tongues and interpretation there. God said, I give you this city in those tongues and interpretation of the tongues. I never forgot it. Came to me in prayer one day. There was no one else in ministry able to take that promise other than myself, and I needed to go there. So I did, and God gave us a building and people, and it was actually quite amazing. Awesome revival broke out, and that tongue interpretation was again confirmed. Amazing story. I feel chills talking about it even today. And there's a great harvest and revival there. Now, back in those days, I used to travel in the airplane and the motorhome. Amazing. We've seen some great times. Awesome revival. People getting the Holy Ghost, 30, 40 every Sunday between all the churches. Baptized, people being healed, filled with the Spirit. Amazing times. Unforgettable. I had this big pusher motorhome. And I would step out of church on Sunday morning in Bakersfield with a driver in the seat, food on the table, get in it, and drive to Fresno. We had service in Bakersfield at 10 o'clock, Fresno at 2:38, have church, revival, amazing, red hot, fire church, chairs, people standing with the doors open in the hallway, amazing revival. That it was the kind of church that you had to stop it all just to get to preach. Not you had to push it, pump it up to try to get back to that, but it was just happening. And I had to, at the time, travel there all the time because I had turned it over to my assistant to be the pastor, and at the time he just wasn't ready. And if I wasn't there, things just didn't work. And so I had to, keep going back and forth. And then we had church in Sonora, and I had church in Sonora Saturday morning. And so I would, with the airplane, I would fly to Sonora Saturday morning and have church there at 11 o'clock, and then fly to Fresno, have church there. We had to, back in the day, man, we had church in Fresno Saturday night, 6 o'clock. It was red hot revival church. And then I would get in the plane, fly to Bakersfield, have church. I know this is crazy, but I'd have church in Bakersfield Sunday morning at 10:30, and then fly to Fresno, have church there at 2:38, fly back to Bakersfield for church at 7 o'clock, and then through the week was crazy. My schedule was Bakersfield Tuesday night, Fresno Wednesday night, Bakersfield Thursday night, and I think across the other south, would keep Friday nights open to go to one of the other churches. But I was preaching 7-8 times a week. It was awesome. It was great times. I remember that motorhome. The youth would pile in it and drive back and forth with us. It turned into a Holy Ghost party bus. Those were good times. But when I bought the plane to fly back and forth to do ministry, when I bought it, I hired this. I'm going to tell you the story about the day I almost died. So I bought this plane in North Carolina. I bought it from this bank that used to fly checks for Bank of America, and Bank of America quit flying checks. They put their money in the computer system. So this company sold off their fleet of planes, $70,000, $80,000 planes for $30,000 a piece. Bank said, you got to sell them. And I just happened to be at the right place, the right time, with money in my hand, and bought a plane. And I, at the time, knew I needed a professional pilot with me. I was still a beginner pilot. And I hired this commercial pilot, and I hired him over the phone through an agency, and they were going to send me a pilot. Well, when they sent me this pilot, they sent me this young, under 30, beautiful young lady who worked for one of the big airlines as a commercial pilot. And we're supposed to fly together. And she asked the question, okay, we have to stop here and here. I just got one room. Is that okay? And I thought, no, that's not okay. And I quickly said, that's not going to work. I actually have someone else going with us. And at the time, I didn't know who was going to go with us, but I knew someone was. And so I called home, and I had one assistant, a young man who had taken an interest in flying and aeronautics. And I said, send me Josh. And he got on a plane, and commercial flight, flew out. And so me, Josh, who at the time I wasn't the skinniest guy, Josh wasn't the skinniest guy. He brought all of his luggage. I had all my luggage. And my commercial pilot lady, who had her luggage, and we got in my Cherokee 6 300 horsepower engine plane and loaded up and did our, there's a bird there, and did our pre-trip flight plan and got ready to roll. Well, everything was going great except for the fact that we had a strong headwind. Now let me explain the strong headwind with the water, because wind and water really reflect each other and explain each other well. If this river is flowing 5 miles an hour and I get in the middle of it and I swim at 5 miles an hour, I am going nowhere. I have to swim at 6 miles an hour to make headway in a stream that's flowing at 5 miles an hour. If I want to make tremendous headway, I need to swim at 10 miles an hour. To go 5 miles an hour where the stream's flowing at 5 miles an hour. And so it is with the wind. If you've got a headwind pushing against you, you're going to use more fuel and energy to go the same distance and keep up the same progress, because the wind that you're flying in is moving backwards and you're trying to move forward. So it's like being in a river on a boat trying to go forward and the water's pushing you backwards. It takes more energy and effort and fuel to go forward than it would if you were going with the current. And so it was that day where, for us, our trip from North Carolina to California, coast to coast, across the fruited plains, we were endeavoring to fly against a headwind. Now that headwind, we had a 300 horsepower private plane. The headwind wasn't a problem, other than it took much more energy, fuel, to stay afloat and to reach the same stops that we had originally planned. We had originally planned out in our flight plan certain stops, places to stay, spend the night. It's not like a commercial flight. You just fly one day, bam, you're there. Small private plane, 160 to 200 mile an hour was pretty much what you're going to do. 160 really is kind of top cruising speed for a 300 horsepower plane with 6 passengers, and so we ended up realizing that the headwind was sucking up all of our fuel, and like that rock, we were pushing up against such a headwind that we were going to have to add in a couple of stops. And we got to this area over Colorado, this city where they mine uranium, I think it is, or plutonium. I think it's uranium. An amazing little city in the middle of nowhere, and it sets at about, I think, between 8,000 and 9,000 feet elevation, if I remember. It could have been a little less than that. It's been so long. All I can remember is we realized that we were going to have to add this fuel stop in that wasn't accounted for originally, and generally you don't want to stop at high altitude, especially in the heat in the summer. Air is, water and air are a lot alike. Heat changes water to vapor, and air with heat turns thin, and you start to lose lift. The hotter it is, the higher the altitude, and the hotter it is, your ability to have that suction on the backside of that wing, that lift, starts to diminish. And if you're in a plane, there are 3 H's that you don't want: heavy, hot, and high. High altitude, heavy load, and heat, because you lose lift dramatically. And so here we are. We had to stop over the Rockies in this little town, fuel up, and then load up. So I remember we filled up. We did a little sightseeing. The airport, a lot of the airports have a little, courtesy car you can jump in, and they did. We found the keys on the floorboard mat somewhere and got in it and read the instructions, went to Walmart and got some blankets because it was so cold in that plane. And when you get to certain altitudes at certain areas across in the country. And so we got in the plane and got back and started to take off. Well, we ran down the runway. We had just fueled up. We had Josh, me, and this pilot, little chick with all her stuff. And we were heavy, and it was hot. And guess what? We're at high altitude. And we took off down the runway, and you should start getting lift at about 60. You should start feeling it. And we get 60 mile an hour, and we're feeling no lift. And we're bumping it up to trying to hit 70, and we're going to hit the end of the runway, and we're barely coming off the ground. And we realize it's too late to abort without a crash, and we're in trouble. We're barely going less than 100 feet per minute. And if you're a pilot, you know that's not good. And so we cleared the fence at the end of the runway, and we went out over a field, and we just started circling, looking for towers or any, thing high that would be in the way, so that we didn't run into it. Well, lo and behold, we circled around, and our instructions from the closest tower was, if I remember correctly, we needed to get to, it's been so long ago, but I want to say 10,000 feet to clear the Rockies where we were, or maybe 11,000. I'll remember when I'm through with this video, but there was a certain altitude we needed to reach before we were to go further west across the rest of the Rockies where we were. And so we got to, let's just say we got to 9,000, and the city was at 7,000 or 8,000. And so we're 1,000, 1,500, 2,000 feet above ground level where we were. And she decides, even at that low climb, 100 feet per minute, that we've been circling just to get that height before we went forward. She said, well, we're gaining. We could probably just go ahead and start headed west, and we'll keep gaining. Well, she did not take into effect commercial Northwest commercial airline pilot. She was young and didn't take into account that when you get to the backside of a mountain, wind does just like that rock. It bowls up, okay? And then on the backside of the mountain, you get that suction. Well, imagine that water is wind, and we're flying from the right side of the video, which should be the downstream side, into that rock. And on the back side of that rock, what you can't see is the wind bowing up on that rock. And on the downside of that rock, there's a suction or a vacuum. But let's imagine that's air, and you can't see that. And so you're flying your airplane. See if I can do this here. You're flying your airplane. Let me see if I can show you. You're flying your airplane. I'm not able to do it. I wanted to show you. You're flying your airplane. You're flying your airplane from this side. You're going along. Let's do it this way. You're flying the airplane this side, and you're going along, and you end up right there. And there's a suction of air on that side of the mountain, and you don't know it. Say you're a little plane, and that's a big mountain. And you're just almost over the top of that, about midway, trying to get out. You're about, let's say, a third from the top down of that mountain, and you're trying to get altitude, climb to get over that mountain. But there's a vacuum. Can you see the vacuum in that rock? There's a vacuum sucking you under. And here we were in that plane on the backside of the mountain, and there was a vacuum pulling us down. And I'll never forget, folks, full pitch attitude, what you call the direction of the nose and the tail of the plane, the fuselage, how it's up or down, is called the attitude of the plane. And boy, there's a message there. Your altitude always determines, well, let's say it this way, your attitude always determines your altitude. And so we had full pitch attitude, full throttle, and that vacuum and started sucking us into the mountain. I'll never forget, it was like a bird soaring on a hillside that just sits there. We were just, the engine roaring, and we were going nowhere. I remember we got down to the point that the stall buzzers started going off. And then we lost lift, and one wing lost lift, and actually we started to spiral. I'll never forget when the plane it went on one side, just fell and started into a spin. And we were only at that point about 1,000 to 800 feet above the mountainside. And the only thing we could do to get out of the spin was to dive into it to create lift again. And we had to nosedive straight into the mountain. And that speed of the nosedive gave us enough lift again to straighten it out and try to pull out of that. Now we're closer to the mountain. We're probably 600 feet from the mountain. I remember looking down at a meadow. I was looking for places to crash land. And it was like time stopped. I could still see the side of that mountain and the areas we may have landed and possibly could have lived. I'll never forget it. And I remember turning to Josh. I remember first texting family members, and amazingly actually went through to pray. And I turned to Josh and I grabbed him by the hand and I said, let's pray. And we began to pray. And we began to cry. And we began to talk in tongues. And I don't know what happened. But when we began to talk in tongues and pray, I promise you, it was like a hand came under that plane and lifted us to the top of that mountain. And when we hit the other side of that mountain, that wind that was bowing up, that high pressure system on the other side of that mountain, we literally shot like a rocket up into the sky. We had to actually turn the altitude to try to stay from going too high. That plane has an altitude limit, and it wasn't equipped with inner oxygen for us, and so we had to throttle back just to keep from going too high. That day, I almost died. But we prayed till we prayed in the Spirit. And literally the hand of God took us and put us over that mountaintop. I'll never forget that pilot. I looked over in the middle of it all when we went to pray, and I seen the commercial pilot, young, beautiful woman on top of the world making money for a large airline. I watched as tears were flowing down her face as she realized we were crashing. But then when we began to pray and talk in tongues and God saved us, it really happened. You say, why you say talk in tongues? I don't know. There was something about when we begin to let the Spirit pray through us, it was like, bam, man, God's hand lifted us above that mess. We got on the other side and we're flying, and we got to a place where we could use cell phones. And I remember the little pilot Barbie chick talking about to her friends. I listened, me and Josh listened to her on the phone, telling everybody, I don't know what happened. She would tell them how it'll happen, and then she would say, I don't know what happened, but these two guys, one's a preacher, and they started chanting something. And when they started chanting, we just all of a sudden, like a rocket, just flew above it all. She had no idea. We tried to tell her, we tried to explain, but she wasn't getting it. All she knew is when those preachers started chanting, we shot like a rocket. God spared my life that day. I shall never forget. And I am so grateful for the mercies and the goodness of God every day in our life. I want to tell someone today, God is with you. If God is for you, who can be against you? Every weapon formed against you will not prosper. God's hand is on you. No matter what you go through, you're going to go through the flood, go through the fire. You might go through a tragedy of circumstance in the air. Yesterday, where I was in the motorhome, I was on a Zoom call with a customer. Big deal. We were working on it. Good client. Really working on a situation to help them. And I started smelling smoke. And so I thought, I stepped away and let someone else continue with the Zoom call and the meeting. And I went into the RV we're in, and I smelled smoke. And I got out of the RV and I looked, and there was smoke billowing out of the back. And I thought, oh no, when I open that, I'm going to feed it. If it's a fire, it's going to get wind. But I had to. So I opened this back compartment, and sure enough, there was an inverter in the battery box area with all the electrical. And this inverter was flaming. I mean, not just a little flame. I mean, it was flaming. And I knew I had a family in that RV, and I had to get it out. And so you don't put water on electrical fire. So all I could do was get a fire extinguisher, and the stupid thing wouldn't work. So dirt was the next best thing. So I started putting dirt on it until I could disconnect the power quick enough. Then we put water on it, and we got it out and saved the motorhome. We had to get grandma out and kids out, and it was an interesting event. But that morning, a man of God, a friend of mine, a pastor, had sent me a message. And in his message, he said, something shocking is going to happen to you today. Be not dismayed. Don't panic. It's his words, he texted. He said, don't panic. It's going to be all right. And I thought of that while I was putting the fire out, electrical fire. He said, something shocking is going to happen to you today. Don't panic. Oh, they just hit my rock. Don't panic. It's going to be all right. Just like those folks just hit my rock. That boat right there just actually ran into that rock. But you know what? It's going to be a rocky road every now and then. They're still afloat. They're still on the river. They're still fishing. They'll live to fish another day. I want to tell someone today, no matter what comes your way, God is with you and you're going to be all right. God bless you. Take on your day in Jesus' name.